He left me standing in white on the church steps with 9 voicemails and a single text. I can't. I walked until the veil caught on a branch in Lincoln Park, sat on a bench, and ugly cried into a bouquet that suddenly felt like a prop. Then an old man dropped his grocery bag right in front of me. I never thought I'd look back and say, that was the moment my life started. The organist was practicing the processional when the church secretary handed me her phone with both hands like it was a relic. "There's a message," she said, her eyes doing 1,000 tiny calculations about what one human should and shouldn't hear from another human before noon on a Saturday. I took the phone. 9 voicemails. The last text was 1 line, a punctuation mark pretending to be a sentence. I can't. It wasn't what I expected from Tyler. If you'd asked me 3 hours earlier, I would have said Tyler's greatest skill was finishing what he started, even if what he started was a fight I didn't want to have or a kitchen remodel we couldn't afford. My greatest skill for the past 3 years had been pretending that determination looked like love. I handed the secretary back her phone and heard myself say, "Okay," because that's what I say when teenagers tell me their grandparents are really their parents and their homework is a job. I'm a high school English teacher on Chicago's South Side. I know how to keep my voice calm when the room isn't. Behind me, my mother inhaled like the sanctuary had just remembered why it was a sanctuary. "Lena," she said, each syllable the size of a plate. "What is it?" I showed her the screen. Tyler's name looked wrong on it, like the font was lying. "He'll be here," she said with the reflex hope of someone who believes in good threads. "He's dramatic. He'll be here." But he wasn't. The priest, who insists I call him Tom and who did my students' college recommendation letters when they needed a signature with weight, put a hand on my shoulder and said, "We can wait," and I loved him for it and hated that the word we made me picture an aisle. "He's not coming," I said, and said it again because my mouth thought maybe it could turn that into a different story if I let the sound hit the wood. My mother was already rearranging the day into something she could manage. "We'll invite everyone to the hall," she said. "We'll say the airline canceled his flight." Tyler had driven 10 minutes from his apartment. "We'll have cake. People love cake." "I need sky," I said, surprising both of us. "I need sky." She pursed her lips like a Bethesda fountain and said, "You cannot go outside in that dress." I went outside in that dress. The veil caught on the church's wrought iron at the top of the steps and yanked my head back the way bad news does. I freed it like I've freed teenagers from zipper incidents and life incidents and walked. I took off my shoes at the corner because lakeshore wind will knock you down if you're pretending your ankles weren't built for city blocks. My bouquet was pretty and heavy and started to smell like a metaphor. By the time I reached Lincoln Park, the sky had gone from auditioning to dramatic big clouds moving like they had somewhere to be. I sat on a bench near the conservatory because it has always felt like a building that believes in kindness, air made of green and second chances. My dress pooled around me like a cloud that had given up. That's when an old man dropped his grocery bag. It split open like a skit, oranges rolling toward the pond, a loaf of bread making a break for the grass, a stubborn jar of jam deciding to test its glass against Chicago's particular version of gravity. He stood there, blinking in a way that made me think the world had just switched channels without asking him if he wanted to change the show. I stood up so fast my veil ripped again. I chased an orange that had ideas above its peel. "Got it," I said, and handed it to him like it was a trophy. He took it, stared at my dress, at my face, at my bouquet, and said, "Oh no." "Right?" I said, and laughed before my body could tell me not to. We both crouched to pick up his groceries. He wore a wool coat that probably fit better 20 years ago, and a cap that said South Shore, like he'd earned it when the neighborhood did. His hands were bigger than I expected, the kind of hands you trust to build something that won't fall. There were specks of soil under his nails, and I liked him immediately for that. We humans love what looks like work. We put the groceries back into the bag, and he said, "I was thinking about jam." Like that explained everything. "It bubbles before it burns. You think you have time until you don't. Then you have smoke." He held up the jar. Tiny horror. "I'm more of a cookies person," I said, "but I respect the jam hustle." He smiled in a way that made His whole face looked like a door someone had painted shut and just remembered how to open. "You okay?" he asked, not unkindly, not fishing. My fiancé texted, "I can't," I said. "I chose sky." "On the day," he said, as if weather could be categorized into that and not that. "Oh, kid." "I'm 31, I said. "Same thing," he said. He gestured to the bench and, without actually saying, "sit," made it clear he was a man whose confidence could make hospitality happen by posture alone. I sat. He sat. The bread sat between us like a neutral party. "I'm Arthur," he said, offering a hand. "Lena," I said, shaking it. "Short for?" he asked, like a grandfather who used to write formal letters. "Magdalena," I said. My mother wanted. Something people couldn't spell and would never put on a keychain. "The curse of CVS," he said. We watched the pond make a convincing argument for staying still. A kid on a bike rode past making the prat-prat sound with his lips that I associate with summer. I breathed and felt something click back into place in my ribs where air had been unwilling to lounge. "You marrying someone who doesn't like hard things?" Arthur asked, almost offhand, as if he were asking if I preferred jam with seeds or without. I opened my mouth to defend Tyler and heard nothing in particular come out. "He likes how things look when they're done," I said. "He hates the part where you have to get there." "And you?" he asked. "I like a pot that simmers," I said, surprising myself because it was more true than my usual answers to strangers, and because maybe I'd needed to say it to hear it. He nodded. "Would your mother like to skin me alive if I offered you tea?" "She'll join you," I said. "She likes a project." He pointed toward the conservatory cafe. "They have chamomile that tastes like good decisions," he said, getting up with a grunt that made me want to help him and not insult him at the same time. "Sit," I said. "I'll get it." "You'll steal my wallet if I let you," he said, reaching into his coat. "I'm wearing a wedding dress and no shoes," I said. "If I'm a pickpocket, I'm terrible at it." He laughed, found 2 crumpled 5s, and handed them to me like proof that the world didn't have to be a jerk today. I bought tea and a ginger cookie that is better than a hug when you're grieving pastry. When I came back, he had pulled a second grocery bag from a pocket of his coat like a magician and repacked his food like he did this regularly, like the world can be counted on to let go of what you carry. We sat again. He sipped his tea like a person who remembers how. "Want to know what I was supposed to be doing an hour ago?" I asked, because my body needed a story to line up behind it. "Oh, kid," he said softly. "No." "I had a veil," I said. "And an aisle. And a text. You got a bench instead," he said. "Bench is better. Benches don't lie." I leaned back, let the bench take some of my weight, and let my eyes fill just enough to keep things honest, but not so much the world went blurry. "I'm 86, he said, "which means I have advice even when nobody asked for it. It also means I'm allowed to be wrong. But here's a thing I know. If a person tells you who they are in 6 characters, most of the time you should say, 'Thank you,' and move your furniture accordingly." "I can't," I said, echoing, tasting it, hating it. "You can," he said. I must have made a face because he added, "Not today. Today you drink chamomile and eat a cookie and let old men say too many words." "Who are you?" I asked. "Widower," he said, and smiled like he meant it. "Before that, lawyer. Before that, son of a conscientious grocery cashier who taught me the sound a tomato makes when you drop it from the second shelf." "Judge?" I asked, because his robeless authority ran on a frequency that was familiar to my courtroom adjacent. Years helping kids the system likes to misfile. He cocked his head. 11 years on the bench, yes, county first, then circuit. We did our best. Our best wasn't enough. He said it like a confession, not a boast. I liked him more. We sat. Dishonesty has a hard time in fresh air. It shivers and goes home. "Do you have somewhere to be?" he asked after a bit. "Apparently not," I said. "Come see something then," he said, standing despite the coat and the years as fluid as they could be. "It's either this or we both go inside out like balloons, from sitting too long." He walked me to a corner of the park I'd never bothered with. Past the conservatory, behind a hedge, there's a community garden, one of the city's pilot projects that survived because older people kept showing up with confidence and younger people kept showing up with energy. Beds of chard, tomatoes, under cages. A row of zinnias the color of good popsicles. A sign that said Green Line Garden. I started this with 3 other old fools in 1998, he said. We wanted our grandkids to believe in food that wasn't shipped here with its own frequent flyer miles. We tabled in snow. We lost 2 petitions. We won the 3rd, and a guy from the city who'd been told not to say no to old ladies and old men who refused to be adorable. Now we feed 100 families in a good month, 50 in a bad. He picked up a hose, handed it to me, and said, "You look like you could do something that matters for 20 minutes. I took it. On my wedding day, in a ripped veil and bare feet, I watered Swiss chard next to a retired judge who had jam on his mind. I don't know that I have ever done anything more honest." My phone buzzed in my bouquet where I'd tucked it like a secret. Mom, 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 Tyler, delete. I shut it off and watered until the clay pots looked like they believed in me. When I stopped, people I hadn't seen before were watching us with tomato plant biceps and the kind of smiles you give a person who doesn't realize they're auditioning for a club. They waved like the parade had finally come. "Now what?" I asked Arthur. "Now," he said, "you meet me here Monday at 4 o'clock in normal pants, and you'll help me until you remember your name without his attached to it." "I have a name," I said. "Say it," he said. "Lena." "Say it like soup," he said. "Lena," I said, laughing. "Good," he said. "Soup." He took my bouquet and stuck it in an empty pot and said, "We grow our own flowers here, too." My mother found me there. She is not a woman who loses things. She is a woman who finds even the thing that doesn't want to be seen. She took one look at the dirt on my white dress and sat on an upside-down bucket the way people sit in movies when they don't have time to find a chair. She was not the mother who raised me in that moment. She was my mother. "Baby," she said. "Hi," I said. "Tyler's mother called me," she said. "She said he's panicking. He said he wants to try again. Next month," he says, "we can do a simple courthouse." "No," I said, and the word felt like a good shoe. "He's afraid," she said. "So am I," I said. "I'm afraid of a life where my job is convincing a man I'm softer than I am, so he can be harder than he needs to be." She looked at the dirt on my dress and sighed, not out of exasperation, out of something that sounded like surrender. "Okay," she said. "Okay." She put a hand on Arthur's shoulder because she was raised right and asked, Can I help with something?" He pointed to a bed of basil and said, "Pinch it. It likes pain." She smiled, at the plant and at the metaphor. I went home, at sundown, left my dress in a pile on the bathroom floor because it had done enough for one day, and texted the 36 people I owed words to. I told them the truth in one paragraph and invited them to do me a favor. Remember I said yes to something else. Ask me in a week how my plants are doing. On Monday at 4, I showed up to the garden with jeans and shoes and sunscreen, and no idea how to stand next to this version of myself without making a joke. Arthur waved me over and handed me a bucket labeled waist knot and a pair of gloves that had seen better hands. He introduced me to Sadie, who runs the youth program that teaches kids about soil pH and receipts. He introduced me to Irene, who remembers when the city was meaner to sunshine. He introduced me last to Leo, who repairs things that think they can't be repaired. "Lena, this is my grandson," Arthur said. "He's better than me at everything except jam." Leo stuck out his hand and said, "Hi," with a voice that belonged to someone whose job probably had a siren. He had a line on his left cheek that looked like a story, and blue tape wrapped around one finger because he'd picked the wrong screw, not because he was careless. "Hi," I said. He nodded, toward the hose with a grin. "You were watering in a wedding dress," he said. "We've been talking about it like a legend. The bride of Lincoln Park." "It's not the worst thing to be," I said. He laughed and handed me a trowel. "I could use a legend over here with the tomatoes we planted. I learned to pinch basil. I learned to sit down when I get dizzy because my body thinks it's still waiting for the organ to start." I learned that you can rebuild in public without it being a performance if everyone else there is busy. Tyler tried. He sent miserable texts, then angry ones, then nostalgic ones, the kind that try to make you hold your own memories against you like a weapon. I didn't block him. I made a folder labeled later and put them there. Once, he showed up at the garden in a shirt he thought I liked and a speech he thought would be persuasive. Leo met him at the fence and said, "She's not interested," in a tone that let me realize not every man believes in seeing how much of a woman's no he can turn into a yes. "Who was that?" Leo asked after. "A pet I should never have bought," I said. He snorted, allergic to anything that sheds entitlement. When summer turned Chicago gold and the garden turned Chicago generous, Arthur told me he wanted me to run the Saturday kids program in August. "You're the right combination of rule and sugar," he said. "You can teach a kid how to stand next to their beans and feel proud without grabbing all the beans for themselves. That's 90% of growing." Up, I taught. I made signs. I learned the names of 40 small people faster than I learned the names of 3 colleges I went into debt to attend. I took a photo of a row of tomatoes and texted it to my mother and wrote, "Look, evidence that time can be trusted." She replied with a photo of a peach pie and wrote, "I love you. No wedding pie here. Pie anyway." It was the most honest thing we'd said to each other in months. Arthur came less often as fall approached. He said the cold makes his knees sound like bubble wrap, fun, then annoying. He took my hand one day when we were labeling jars of sauce and said, "I'm going to die someday, don't be shocked. You'll be fine. But I want to see something." He asked me to walk with him to the conservatory. He moved slower, but his mind hopped the way water skips stones. At the bench where we met without planning to meet, he sat and patted the wood like it was a familiar. There, screwed into the slat, was a small brass plaque I had never noticed because I wasn't a person who noticed plaques. Not until he taught me to be in memory of Ruth Green, sit here when you need to remember who you are. "I had that one made for my wife," he said. "But there's another." He pointed to the underside of the bench and lowered himself so he could read it. "The park's people allow 1 hidden plaque per family for grandchildren who like secrets." He looked at me, mischief in a face the world underestimates. "Consulted on a rewrite of the rule," he said. "Read it." I crouched and read, "To the bride who watered chard. Sit here when you choose yourself again. AG. I get to give out exactly 3 hidden plaques in my life," he said. "Ruth got one. My daughter who stopped arguing and started living got another. The third is yours." I pressed my fingers against the metal. It was warm. The world was cold. I looked at him through tears I don't mind anyone seeing. "Thank you," I said, "because some people have earned your simple gratitude more than your dramatic bow." "Thank you," he said. "You showed up. You stayed. You watered." The following spring, the garden needed a new coordinator. Sadie got a job in Milwaukee because her sweetheart had eyes the color of Do the Right Thing. The board, which sounds like a thing in a room but is really 12 old men with opinions and 4 women with agendas, asked me to interview. I wore a dress that doesn't care if it gets dirty and a pair of boots I believe in. Arthur sat in the back like a person who can stay quiet without abandoning you. "You'll need to do grants," the chair said reluctantly, as if he hadn't read the file that explained I write for a living when I'm not coaxing beans into believing in themselves. "I write better than I cook," I said. "You'll eat." They voted. I got the job. It paid less than a wedding I didn't have. It paid enough to justify telling Tyler's last voicemail that I'd changed my number without changing my number. It paid in seeing kids take home produce and say, "My tomato," like that solves injustice in 2 words. On a warm evening in June, after a day of grant deadlines and sprinkler line arguments, Leo asked if I wanted tacos. He had a way of asking that sounded like he had already made tacos but wouldn't eat them without me, so neither of us would be rude. I said yes. We ate on his stoop because Chicago stoops have a holy purpose. He told me stories about being a carpenter who fixes things that have forgotten how to be houses. I told him stories about students who think metaphors are weeds and then come back 6 months later and say, "That poem was about my grandmother's hands, wasn't it? Like they caught a fish and threw it back." He took my hand like it was a door he didn't need to knock on. You know, he said, you don't have to love my grandfather to love me. That's convenient, I said, because I love both of you. We did it right. We didn't rush. We had dinner with my mother in August, and she tried to talk us out of him because she still doesn't trust men who make kitchens and gardens instead of deals. Leo handled her like a person with a whole family of his own, learning to change their stories slowly. He brought jam. She surrendered. The next fall, I took 2 small people to school on the first day, and was the mother who embarrassed them by crying, and was the woman who didn't care about embarrassment more than pride. See you after school, I said in the voice I used to reserve for nice emails to principals, and they said love you to the air like they were feeding it. I went to the garden and made a sign. On a July afternoon, 2 years to the day after I watered chard in a dress that still smelled like apology, I stood in a community garden that now had a shed I organized, and said the words I didn't know I'd get to say. Do you want to get married here? Yes, Leo said. And his yes didn't try to convince me of anything, except the thing yes is supposed to convince you of, that staying is an action verb. We got married in September under a trellis the kids helped decorate, with signs that said things like, don't step on the kale because we are raising them right. My mother cried like she'd invented the concept. Arthur walked me, then sat on the bench with Ruth's plaque and our hidden one, and gave his granddaughter a look history needed. We served tacos and jam thumbprints and let kids run around like they were staining the world in ways we could wash out tomorrow. Tyler did not show up. He had married someone else, my mother told me 6 months later, as if that were a piece of trivia I might like to collect. I nodded, and did not add him to any collector's box I owned. At the end of the night, when everyone had eaten and nobody had compared anyone's marriage to anyone else's, I sat on my bench, still in my dress, shoes kicked off as if that were my signature. The garden smelled like basil and summer and patience. I pressed my fingers to the hidden plaque and didn't need to read it to remember. Choosing yourself isn't lonely if you build a place for other people to sit while you do. And my family came to me in unlikely ways. So did my job, my bench, my second yes. I don't recommend abandonment as a hobby. I recommend benches and old men and keeping your hands busy until your heart catches up. Thank you, Tyler, I said to the sky in a way he will never deserve to. Here. Thank you, Arthur, I said to the earth in a way that plants understand. I went home with dirt on my wedding dress again. Not because I was abandoned, because I had work to do and a table to set.